Somewhere at a radio station in the United States, in 1980, a programmer received a complaint for playing a Bee Gees song. Without anyone telling him to, he made a note on his internal playlist. That name didn't play on that station again for years. In 1978, the Bee Gees had 5 songs simultaneously in the top 10 in the United States. 2 years later, radio stations had an unspoken ban on playing their name. No executive signed that order. Nobody needed to.
We got something going on.
While the world declared them dead, they kept writing the number ones that same world was dancing to without knowing where they were coming from. This is the story of how you win a war after losing everything in public. If you think the Bee Gees' fall was the ending, it's because nobody ever told you what happened next. There is a speed at which success stops being an achievement and starts being a problem. The Bee Gees hit that speed in 1978 without realizing they had already crossed the line. Saturday Night Fever was not just a soundtrack, it was the best-selling album in history up to that point, with over 40 million copies sold around the world. John Travolta's film turned every Gibb Brothers song into the mandatory sound of any space where there were people and a dance floor. The discos, the radios, the televisions, the magazines, the posters on the bedroom walls of teenagers across half the world. The Bee Gees weren't everywhere, they were everywhere. And that level of presence, which any artist would describe as the ultimate dream, contained within itself the exact mechanism of its own destruction. Five songs in the top 10 at the same time is a number with no precedent in the history of modern pop. Not even the Beatles at their peak had pulled that off. For that to happen, something very specific has to occur across the entire chain of production, distribution, and radio programming. Everything has to function simultaneously in the same direction. And when everything functions like that, the result isn't just omnipresence, it's saturation. There is a point at which the human brain, any human brain, begins to process repetition, not as pleasant familiarity, but as noise. The Bee Gees crossed that point at a speed the industry had never seen before and didn't know how to handle. What nobody saw coming was the speed of the reversal. In 1977, they were respected songwriters who had come back from the dead with Jive Talkin' and had proven they could reinvent themselves. In 1978, they were the global symbol of something that still didn't have a name, but was already beginning to generate antibodies. But 5 songs in the top 10 still don't explain how someone goes from being the biggest artist on the planet to becoming the joke nobody wants to tell. For that, you have to understand what massive success does to perception, and what perception does to reality. Before Saturday Night Fever, the music industry knew exactly what the Bee Gees were. Songwriters. That was what defined them. They had been writing songs for other artists for years. They had a catalog that spanned genres and decades. The industry respected them in the specific way it respects someone who can do something technically difficult with the professional distance you keep from a master craftsman. But Saturday Night Fever dropped an image on top of them that was so powerful, so visual, so completely defined, that it erased everything underneath. Suddenly, the Bee Gees were no longer the men who had written "To Love Somebody" or "How Can You Mend a Broken Heart." They were the gold medallion, the shirt open to the navel, the falsetto, the dance floor. The costume had devoured the composer, and the costume was the only thing the industry and the public knew how to see.
How deep is your love? Is your love how deep?
What makes that transformation especially cruel is that it was not a drop in quality. The records the Bee Gees were making in 1978 were technically just as good as everything they had made before. Barry Gibb was still one of the most prolific and precise songwriters in popular music at that time, but the perception had changed in a way that could not be reversed. When an artist's image becomes so rigid that the public can no longer separate the person from the persona, everything that artist does gets filtered through the persona. And the disco persona filter was so specific, so saturated with associations to a cultural moment that was already beginning to feel excessive, that it made it impossible to hear the music without also hearing everything that music had come to represent. Cultural fatigue is not hatred. It's something harder to manage than hatred. Hatred has a clear object. Fatigue is diffuse, cumulative, and when it explodes, it doesn't announce clearly where it's pointing. The fatigue the world felt toward the Bee Gees in 1979 was not rational. It was the inevitable reaction of a collective nervous system that had received too much of the same stimulus for too long, and that reaction was going to find a release valve. The fatigue had a name, and it had a date, and the night it exploded literally. On July 12, 1979, at Comiskey Park in Chicago, someone lit a fuse. What burned that night was not just plastic. Steve Dahl was a radio DJ who had lost his job when his station switched formats from rock to disco. He had a personal grievance and an audience that shared it. The idea was simple and spectacular between the two baseball games scheduled that day. Fans who brought a disco record would pay reduced admission. The records would be destroyed in the middle of the field with explosives. The response exceeded every expectation. More than 50,000 people filled the stadium. Another 5,000 were left outside, unable to get in. They brought records in bags, in boxes, in their hands. And when the explosives detonated in the middle of the field, the crowd didn't applaud. It roared. What that night revealed was not hatred of disco music in the abstract. It was something more specific and more uncomfortable. Disco music had been born in the black and gay clubs of New York City in the early 70s. It was music belonging to minorities who found in the dance floor a space the outside world denied them. When that music went mainstream, when the industry turned it into a global product and put the face of three Australian brothers in white suits on it, something was lost in the process. What burned at Comiskey Park was not the original music, it was the commercialized version. But the Bee Gees, who had been the most visible face of that commercialization, paid the highest price. What Disco Demolition Night did to the Bee Gees was something no commercial failure could ever have done. It turned them into the symbol of something the world had decided to reject. They were no longer just a group that was out of fashion. They were the face of excess, of commercialization, of everything rock felt disco had stolen from it in terms of cultural space and media attention. That night in Chicago didn't choose the Bee Gees for musical reasons. It chose them for symbolic reasons. And symbols are much harder to rehabilitate than records. The stadium went cold. The records burned. And someone at a Chicago radio station, the very next day, made a decision no executive had asked them to make. There was no meeting. There was no memo. There was no corporate decision signed by anyone. What happened to the Bee Gees on American radio starting in 1980 is one of the strangest and most revealing phenomena in the history of how the music industry actually functions when it decides something is over. Radio programmers, independently, at different stations, in different cities, with no coordination between them, arrived at the same conclusion. Playing a Bee Gees song generated immediate complaints. The switchboards filled with calls. Listeners changed the dial. And in a business where the audience is the product being sold to advertisers, losing listeners over 30 seconds of music is a sufficient argument for never playing that music again. And so, without anyone ordering it, the ban installed itself. Did you know that Islands in the Stream, the song Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton took to #1 all over the world, was written by the same men radio had declared untouchable just 2 years earlier. What the label told them was more direct than any informal ban. Their name was radioactive. Those were, according to accounts from that period, the exact words, or something very close to them. Not the sound. Not the quality of the music, the name, the face, the association. A record with the name Bee Gees on the cover was not going to be programmed by any radio station and was not going to be purchased by any distributor that wanted to maintain good relationships with those stations. The industry that had crowned them 2 years earlier was telling them, with all the coldness the industry reserves for when it decides something is over, that the problem was not what they did, but who they were. The most revealing thing about that ban is not the cruelty, it's the arbitrariness. The songs the Bee Gees were writing in 1981 were not worse than the ones they had written in 1977. The quality had not changed. What had changed was the cultural context in which those songs were going to be received, and that context was so hostile that no amount of quality could overcome it. The industry had not banned their music. It had banned their history. They had taken away the microphone. They had closed every radio door. They had told them their name was poison. Nobody had told them they couldn't write. The name that couldn't be heard on any radio kept playing on all of them. Nobody just knew it. When the door to performing closed, Barry Gibb did what songwriters do. When the world doesn't want to hear them directly, he wrote for others to say it, not as defeat, as strategy. The same instinct that had led them to submit a record in a plain white sleeve in Miami in 1975 now led them to a different but equally precise place. If the problem was the face, they would remove the face. If the problem was the name, they would put another name on it. What they could not remove was the music. And the music was still exactly as good as it had always been. Guilty, the album Barry Gibb produced and co-wrote with Barbra Streisand in 1980, sold over 20 million copies around the world. It was one of the most successful albums of that year. The radio stations that had the Bee Gees name banned programmed it without hesitation because the cover said Barbra Streisand. The same year the industry had told them their name was radioactive, Barry Gibb had an album at #1 across half the world. Only nobody knew it was his. And that, far from being a failure, was the most precise demonstration of something the industry never wanted to admit. The problem had never been the music. Today, when someone hears Islands in the Stream without knowing its history, they hear a Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton song. When someone hears Chain Reaction without knowing its history, they hear a Diana Ross song. When someone hears Guilty without knowing its history, they hear a Barbra Streisand song. None of those people are exactly wrong. Those artists sang it, recorded it, put their voice to it. But the architecture of those songs, the melodic structure, the way the chorus arrives, the way the emotion rises and falls, all of that came from the same sources, Stayin' Alive and How Deep Is Your Love. The entire world kept dancing and crying to the rhythm of the Gibb brothers throughout that entire decade. Only this time, nobody burned their records because nobody knew they were theirs. Barry Gibb won that war. But the way he won it is a question that still doesn't have a completely comfortable answer. And that question lives in the final stretch of this story. There is a question in this story that the music industry prefers not to ask out loud. If the Bee Gees could write #1s throughout the entire decade of the 1980s, while their own name was banned from radio, what does that say about the ban? It says the ban was never an evaluation of quality. It was an evaluation of context. The music industry did not discard their talent. It discarded their accumulated history the image it had built around them during the peak of Saturday Night Fever, the association with a cultural moment the world had decided to reject. And what the Bee Gees demonstrated from anonymity is that an artist can survive that kind of dismissal if they are capable of separating what they do from what they are called. That requires a specific kind of humility that not many artists in their position would have had. What Barry Gibb did in the 1980s was not surrender. It was exactly the opposite. Surrendering would have meant accepting that the industry's judgment about their name was also a judgment about their music. Instead, he made the decision to prove that the two things were separable, and he did it the only way the proof could be irrefutable, by putting his music at #1 without his name on top of it. When Guilty sold 20 million copies, nobody at Atlantic Records could argue the problem had been quality. When Islands in the Stream reached #1, nobody could argue the public had rejected the way he composed. What the public had rejected was the image. And the image was the industry's problem, not theirs. Barry Gibb was the last of the three brothers. Robin died in 2012. Andy, the younger brother, had died in 1988, when the years of the band had not entirely ended. Barry carried the complete story for decades. The peak, the fall, the exile, the invisible war, and the comeback the world was slow to recognize as such. In the interviews of his later years, he spoke about that era with the precision of someone who understood very early that the music industry has a short memory for achievements and a long memory for associations, and that the only way to break a negative association is not to convince the world it was wrong, but to give it something new it cannot ignore, no matter what name it arrives under. They burned them in public. They kept writing in the dark, and the world kept dancing to their music without knowing it was theirs. That is not a defeat disguised as victory. It is the most precise definition that exists of what it means to be a true songwriter, that the music survives even when the name cannot. That moment happened once, but what it left behind is still playing.